Darwin concludes that man is becoming more self-aware, more intelligent, more advanced, not because he submits to God's revelation, but because he is evolving into a higher creature. For Darwin, religion is just a phase as the human species evolves into a higher form. However, his explanation of the evolution of man is arbitrary and baseless, without historical evidence.
You're listening to Passing on the Faith, a podcast from Generations. Every week, we bring you a powerful moment from one of our sermons, audiobooks, webinars, or conference talks, handpicked to help you build a strong biblical foundation for your family. This week's episode is our chapter from our audiobook, Apostate, entitled Charles Darwin, Forming the Humanist Scientist.
Chapter 10, Forming the Humanist Scientist. Charles Darwin, AD 1809 to 1882. Charles Darwin came from a long line of Christian apostasy that began with John Locke's ideological children of the 18th century. The Oxford latitudinarians of the 17th century gave birth to the Unitarians of the 18th century, who gave birth to the agnostics and atheists of the 19th century. And no family better personified this trend than the Darwin lineage. Charles' father, Robert, at first associated with the Unitarians, and later referred to himself as a, quote, free thinker. Charles' father, Erasmus Darwin, was a pioneering humanist and an Enlightenment thinker in his own right. Influenced strongly by men like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he advocated radical educational programs. Well before Charles Darwin entered the picture, Erasmus was one of the first evolutionists. He published a number of controversial books theorizing the evolution of man, a Big Bang sort of cosmology, and the transmutation of species. In his poetic compositions, Erasmus Darwin presented nature as a self-determining and independent of any creator. In his words, quote, nature is powerful and autonomous enough to break the supposedly exclusive society between God and spiritual beings, unquote. Clearly, Erasmus Darwin rejected a God who is involved in nature as creator and sustainer of all. Well into the 19th century, it was still fashionable for England's bright young prodigies to enroll in the old Cambridge Seminary. The external religious forms continued strong despite the worldview revolution that was radicalizing seminaries and universities. If we have learned anything about the breakdown of the Christian church, it is that the preeminent Christian seminaries must lead the apostasy. Charles Darwin entered Cambridge University in 1828, fully intending to prepare for the ministry. Early in his university experience, Darwin wrote that he, quote, did not then at the least doubt the strict and literal truth of every word of the Bible, unquote. However, it wasn't long before Darwin's commitment to biblical truth faded. While his wife Emma continued in the Unitarian faith until the end of her life, Charles diligently labored to eliminate every vestige of the Christian faith from his thinking. This was no easy feat, but he applied interminable, determined effort to the task, achieving remarkable success in this thoroughgoing apostasy. In his autobiography written towards the end of his life, he referred to the Christian faith as, quote, manifestly false, and the Christian God as, quote, a revengeful tyrant. The Bible, he said, is, quote, no more to be trusted than the beliefs of a barbarian, unquote. Darwin's metaphysical journey is a little hard to follow at points, but by the end of his life, he claimed the identification of agnostic as a more correct description of my state of mind. Although Darwin would make reference to a creator in his public writings, he admitted in private letters that this was merely a marketing ploy intended to curry public favor. Darwin wrote, quote, I have long regretted that I truckled to a public opinion and used the Pentateuchal term of creation, by which I really meant appeared by some wholly unknown process, unquote. November 24th, 1859, may be the most important date in modern history. The world would never be the same after the publication of Charles Darwin's magnum opus, On the Origin of Species. After 28 years of research and intense mental struggle, Darwin introduced his ideas to a world that was waiting for an intellectual explanation for a materialistic ontology. The first print run sold out in a day. In one sense, Darwin met a market need. The modern world was looking for an escape hatch from the Christian faith and the biblical God, and this was their opportunity. In our search for the forces that brought about this epochal apostasy, it is easy to oversimplify the equation. On the one hand, the great philosophical minds did provide the intellectual ammunition to lead the masses. But there were other spiritual forces at work. Apostasy was the zeitgeist, or the spirit of the age. By the mid-19th century, millions of people were just looking for a reason to abandon the old faith, with its moral restrictions, its pessimistic assessment of human nature, its bloody atonement, and its suffer now, rewards later narrative. Darwin worked powerfully on the psyche of the Western world. He could not disprove the existence of God, but if he could identify a natural mechanism for the development of the complexity of life forms, then there would be less of a need for God as a causal force. Charles Darwin hypothesized that mankind and the various species of animals evolved by form of a natural selection, in which the most physically fit mutations, those that were better adapted to the environment, survived while the weaker died out. Darwin's hypothesis perfectly accommodated the growing deism and agnosticism of the day, because it took God out of the picture. If this was a viable explanation for the development of the complexity of biological life, then it rendered a creator God obsolete in the process. These were heady times for modern man, who thought he could rid himself of God. But alas, over the years, things did not go well for Darwin's hypothesis. Although much of the scientific world still embraces the macro theory, many evolutionary scientists have now given up on the gradualist mechanisms. Some evolutionists now postulate a strange, unproven mechanism called punctuated equilibrium, which can hardly be considered a natural process and rather resembles supernatural creationism. Furthermore, no substantial evidence for transitional forms have been found in the fossil record, forms which might have helped identify a mechanism. Considering that scientists have never replicated cross-species evolution in a laboratory setting, and the fossil record has added little substantiation to the theory, over 150 years, the theory is more tenuous now than ever. Darwinism will not survive the test of time. The character of the man. A careful reading of Darwin's autobiography and personal letters reveals a very strange man indeed. In the modern vernacular, he was a twisted individual. By his own admission, he was a sadist, and he took great enjoyment from torturing and killing animals. He especially loved to kill birds by pounding on their heads with a hammer. From the time he was 17 years old, he dedicated his summers and autumns to killing animals, not for meat, but for the sheer delight of killing. While in our day this might bother a member of PETA, it should be particularly troublesome to the Christian who believes Proverbs 12, verse 10. Quote, "The righteous man regards the life of his beast, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel." Unquote. As he made plans for the voyage on the Beagle, Darwin included several guns in hopes that he might be able to kill some cannibals. Even as a child, he would beat puppies, quote, "simply from enjoying the sense of power." Unquote. Entire books have been written on the subject of Darwin's psychological problems. He suffered from depression, agoraphobia, insomnia, vision alterations, hallucinations, malaise, vertigo, shaking, tachycardia, fainting spells, shortness of breath, trembling, nausea, vomiting, dizziness, muscle twitches, spasms, tremors, cramps, and colics, nervous exhaustion, dyspnea, skin blisters, tinnitus, and sensations of loss of consciousness, and impending death. According to Darwin's own testimony, his problems began at 16 years of age. And by the time he was 28, he was virtually incapacitated by his mental illnesses. These maladies were so chronic that Darwin scholar Michael Roos concluded that he must have been an invalid for the last 43 years of his life. In personal letters to friends, he wondered if his book, On the Origin of Species, might be the cause of, quote, "the main part of the ills which my flesh is heir to," unquote. Dr. Jerry Bergman believed there was a strong connection between Darwin's religious apostasy and his psychosis. Drawing from Darwin's own admissions in his personal letters, Bergman writes, quote, "His nagging, gnawing fear about murdering God caused a cold shudder to run through him because of his fear that he had devoted his life to a fantasy, an illusion, and a dangerous one at that." Unquote. Darwin's epistemology.
One of the greatest challenges we have as Christian parents is to pass on the faith to our children, not just in theory, but through the living and active Word of God. That's why we've created Teach Me the Faith. It's a brand new podcast from Generations, and it's based on our Scripture Memory Catechism, helping children learn who God is, what He has done, and how to walk in His ways. One question, one verse, and one simple episode at a time. It's short, it's clear, and it's meant to be done together as a family, on the way to school, around the dinner table, or before bed. So start listening today at teachmethefaith.com. That's teachmethefaith.com.
The descent of man also opens the door to the dreadful practice of eugenics, selective breeding of human beings to eliminate certain perceived genetic weaknesses. Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, pioneered early research in eugenics and prepared the world for Adolf Hitler and the eugenics programs in America. It is also no real surprise that Darwin enthusiastically endorsed Galton's book, Hereditary Genius, calling it a, quote, "great work." Nor is it any surprise that Darwin's own son, George, was an active supporter of eugenics and published an article on the, quote, better breeding of humans. Opposition to these ideas at the turn of the 20th century was all too rare, with little resistance coming from a severely weakened Christian church. However, G.K. Chesterton helpfully categorized these humanist ideas with the little quip, quote, "If Darwinism is the doctrine of survival of the fittest, eugenics is the doctrine of survival of the nastiest." Unquote. A man's worldview informs his science, his hypothesizing, and his interpretation of the data in his scientific inquiries. We are less interested in Darwin's science than we are in his worldview, through which he filters his scientific data and forms his hypotheses. If ideas have consequences, what are the fundamental ideas that yielded such dangerous consequences? As with many philosophers, Darwin's fundamental worldview comes into full fruition in his later writings. In a key passage in The Descent of Man, Darwin writes, quote, "The same high mental faculties which first led man to believe in unseen spiritual agencies, then in fetishism, polytheism, and ultimately in monotheism, would infallibly lead him, as long as his reasoning powers remained poorly developed, to various strange superstitions and customs. Many of these are terrible to think of, such as the sacrifice of human beings to a blood-loving God, the trial of innocent persons by the ordeal of poison or fire, witchcraft, etc. Yet it is well occasionally to reflect on these superstitions, for they show us what an infinite debt of gratitude we owe to the improvement of our reason, to science, and to our accumulated knowledge." Unquote. From the outset, Darwin assumes that men really are thinking independently of divine revelation when they devise their theistic conceptions. His grand assumption is that man reasons for himself in a world without God. According to Darwin, man ponders his own existence and surroundings while gradually working his way towards higher intelligence in the evolutionary process. He lumps monotheism with the primitive religions of polytheism and fetishism. Also important to this survey, Darwin shudders at the notion that God would require a blood sacrifice or blood atonement for sin. This must include the Christian doctrine of atonement by the sacrifice of Christ, God's own Son on the cross. In the enlightened age of rank humanism, atheists are especially offended by this doctrine and typically regard it as primitive and repulsive. Further on in the passage, Darwin expresses relief that highly evolved modern man has finally abandoned these old, quote, superstitions and customs. For Darwin, then, a right understanding of reality is entirely dependent upon man's improvement of his own reason and science. There is no place for special revelation or any revelation from God whatsoever for Darwin. How primitive man comes upon a conception of God in a world where God does not exist is a conundrum to the mind of the evolutionary naturalist. This argument forms Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. These religious conceptions demand an explanation, and Darwin pulls an answer out of a hat. He opts for a psychological explanation, attempting to attribute man's spiritual nature to another animal trait. According to Darwin, all notions about the cruder religions and the more advanced monotheistic religions, such as Christianity, come from the same high mental faculties, and God does not reveal himself to man. The evolutionist must view man as alone in the universe, and he therefore will have to figure things out for himself. Darwin concludes that man is becoming more self-aware, more intelligent, more advanced, not because he submits to God's revelation, but because he is evolving into a higher creature. For Darwin, religion is just a phase as the human species evolves into a higher form. However, his explanation of the evolution of man is arbitrary and baseless, without historical evidence. It is true that ancient civilizations did not have access to the applied science available today, but only because technology requires significant manpower, division of labor, and multiple generations to develop. Actually, archaeological research of ancient civilizations has uncovered amazing architectural feats, well-developed art forms, complex mechanical devices, and advanced social systems, proof that ancient man was just as intelligent as modern man. Where primitive, uncivilized tribes are discovered in recent centuries, it is clear that these people had little or no access to the covenant people of God, where divine revelation had enabled human culture, civilization, and society. Significantly, in The Descent of Man, Darwin rejects any discrete distinction between the animal kingdom and the human kingdom. Quote, "The mental faculties of man and the lower animals do not differ in kind, although immensely in degree." Unquote. This is a radical departure from Psalm 8. Quote, "Thou hast made him a little lower than the angels. Thou hast put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen." Unquote. The implications of Darwin's ideas are frightening, especially when it comes to human morality. If the human is no different from the animal, what then is rape or infanticide? What happens to moral authority, and how does human morality differ from random animal instinct and behavior? Darwin and eugenics. By far, the most controversial element of Charles Darwin's legacy is the Adolf Hitler connection. If modern humanists still recognize one villain in history, Hitler usually makes the list. Therefore, evolutionists must repudiate any connection between Darwin and the German Nazi, and carefully avoid references to Darwin's support of eugenics. For our purposes, this consideration is of essence. In accordance with the immortal word spoken by Jesus Christ, we cannot separate ideas and consequences, teachers and their fruits. Matthew 7, verse 20. What follows is the most egregious section of Darwin's The Descent of Man. Quote, "With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who, from a weak constitution, would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It is surprising how soon a want of care, or care wrongly directed, leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. The aid which we feel impelled to give to the helpless is mainly an incidental result of the instinct of sympathy, which was originally acquired as part of the social instincts, but subsequently rendered, in the manner previously indicated, more tender and more widely diffused. Nor should we check our sympathy even at the urging of hard reason, without deterioration of the noblest part of our nature. The surgeon may harden himself whilst performing an operation, for he knows that he is acting for the good of his patient. But if we were intentionally to neglect the weak and helpless, it could only be for a contingent benefit, with an overwhelming present evil. We must therefore bear the undoubtedly bad effects of the weak surviving and propagating their kind. But there appears to be at least one check in steady action, namely that the weaker and inferior members of society do not marry so freely as the sound, and this check must be indefinitely increased by the weak in body or mind refraining from marriage, though this is more to be hoped for than expected." Unquote. In true Nephilim style, the author weaves and bobs. He is slippery, purposefully inconsistent, and ominously vague. Deceptive obfuscation only accentuates the evil character of men who toy with the idea of racial extermination. In the first sentence in the quotation, Darwin almost approves of the survival of the fittest mechanism operating among the savages who do not check the process of elimination. He half-heartedly recommends a limitation on marriage for the weaker and inferior members of society, but he reveals his true agenda while admitting to his own inconsistencies, as he holds on to something called, quote, the noblest part of our nature. At some point, however, the, quote, overwhelming present evil will trump the contingent benefit, and the surgeon will just have to, quote, harden himself whilst performing the operation. This is how Darwin opens the door to powerful social planners who will centralize power and act on their fateful propositions. Later, Friedrich Nietzsche picks up on this and corrects Darwin's purposeful inconsistencies, providing the link to Adolf Hitler. Apologists for Darwin have done their best to present this great oracle of naturalism in the best light. After all, he was the guru and the messiah for the humanist apostasy in the West. However, any way you cut it, the above quotation is evil incarnate. What spirit must have descended upon Darwin as he wrote those fateful words? This is the kind of writing that sets the agenda for the ultimate evil that shows up in future generations. Something evil this way comes. Genocide. Regrettably, Darwin isn't done yet. In Chapter 6 of this very bad book, Darwin includes another frightening remark concerning extermination of races. Warning, this may be the most evil words ever recorded in human history, as measured by the subsequent effects on human society. Quote, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schaffhausen has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope even then the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. Unquote. Granted, The extermination Darwin speaks of is descriptive and not prescriptive. The silent presupposition underlying this writing is this: the descriptive forms the prescriptive. If the fittest survives in a tooth and claw world, then this is what is supposed to happen. This argumentation is similar to that used by Jeremy Bentham. Charles Darwin isn't prescribing the extermination necessarily, but neither does he discourage it. His worldview already disallows all ethical absolutes governing human action, so now he lays out the ethically acceptable, natural process of human evolution. In view of the hundreds of millions of innocent men and women slaughtered in the succeeding century, the reader cannot help but feel the chill of his words. He writes as a cold, heartless, and detached scientist picking at a live human pinned to his mounting board. This genius Nephilim has less concern for the people groups to be eliminated than he does for the animals he destroyed with his little hammer. If the reader does not shudder a little as he reads these things, then Darwin has proven the point. We have entered a brave new world that fails to respect human life created in the image of God. This is a prophetic statement, an attempt to predestine the extermination of the, quote, savage races. It is for Darwin to establish the metaphysical necessities of naturalist evolutionism. On the one hand, he does not argue for the social imperative of eugenics and genocide, but neither does he argue against it. This is how Charles Darwin paved the way for the megalomaniacs of the 20th century, who thought nothing of exterminating the Jews in Germany, or the Slavs in the Soviet Union, or the Armenians at the hands of the Turks. Against this sad legacy of racism, eugenics, and genocide stands the eternal truths of God's revelatory word. The Bible acknowledges variance in culture, nationality, language, and skin pigment, Jeremiah 13:23, but there is no racial differentiation with the people who trace their lineage to Noah and Adam. God soundly condemned Miriam and Aaron for discriminating against Moses for his Ethiopian wife, Numbers 12, verses 1 through 12. As far as intermarriage is concerned, the Bible sees no issue with intermarriage across families and cultures except for the unequal yoking between believer and unbeliever, light and darkness. 2 Corinthians 6, verse 14. Certain atheists, apologists, have cavilled against God's judgments recorded in the Old Testament, as for example, Sodom and Gomorrah and other tribes in the land of Canaan. Such arguments, however, fail to interact with the whole case. According to the Christian worldview, God is the ultimate judge of the earth and the standard of all morality. If God should choose to judge an entire nation for its widespread use of infanticide, child sacrifice, and homosexuality, he performs his judgment based on morals, not on some cold necessity in a naturalist, materialist world. Of course, those who are given to sins of infanticide, abortion, and homosexuality would be terribly offended by a God who should wish to judge them on the basis of his laws. The problem with atheists is that they have forfeited any absolute ethical standard, so they undermine their own right to argue any ethical case whatsoever. Clearly, God's law for all people today forbids the extermination of whole tribes and people, including women and children, even in warfare between nations. Deuteronomy 20, verses 13 and 14. It is only on this basis that we can claim genocide to be ultimately evil. In Christ's parable of the wheat and the tares, he prohibits any kind of religious jihad. Matthew 13, verse 30. We would argue that there is still a limited use for the civil magistrate for certain gross crimes, but none of this allow for the, quote, extermination of the savage races, unquote. Rather, the gospel is intended to reach every tribe and nation. Quote, and they sung a new song, saying, Thou art worthy to take the book, and to open the seals thereof. For thou wast slain, and hast redeemed us to God by thy blood out of every kindred, and tongue, and people, and nation. Unquote. Revelation 5, verse 9. Every man, woman, and child, regardless of ethnic and cultural background, is made in the image of God. Some have lived in darkness and degradation for a longer period of time than others, such as the South Sea Islanders and the Australian Aborigines, who had little access to the Christian West and the Christian gospel until the mid-19th century. In the 1870s and 1880s, missionaries like John Peyton fought hard against Darwinian whites who were committed to eliminating the, quote, savages in Australia by mass murder. Even Christian pastors like Charles Kingsley were convinced that, quote, the black people in Australia cannot take in the gospel, poor brutes in human shape. They must perish off the face of the earth like brute beasts, unquote. Theistic evolutionists were a sad lot from the beginning. In spite of Darwin and his ilk, the gospel has succeeded in reaching these far-off lands, and thousands who at one time cannibalized one another now commune together at the table of Christ. Ironically, Charles Darwin was blessed with the 1,500 years of Christian heritage, but he abandoned it in favor of a godless, man-centered, metaphysical, and ethical outlook. If Darwin has been blessed with many moral, scientific, and economic improvement in Europe, as compared to the poor savages down in the South Sea Islands, it was only because Europe had a Christian, biblical heritage already formed between AD 33 and AD 1871, the publication year for Darwin's ill-conceived book. And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming. Even him whose coming is after the working of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause God shall send them strong delusion, that they shall believe a lie, that they all might be damned who believed not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 8 through 12. The incredible influence of Charles Darwin. What possible influence could this agnostic, racist, mentally ill sadist have had on any person or persons of intellectual or moral stature in the world? Of course, his influence was titanic. According to multiple recent polls, Charles Darwin is still considered the most influential person in the world. This doesn't say much about the character of the masses in the modern world. Christians have had their men of influence as well. Augustine, Patrick of Ireland, John Chrysostom, Athanasius, Anselm of Canterbury, Thomas à Kempis, Bernard of Clairvaux, Martin Luther, John Bunyan, and George Whitefield come to mind. These leaders have influenced millions, if not billions, of people throughout history. To my knowledge, No historian has described these men as racists, sadists, or insane, nor do their autobiographies reveal anything of this nature. While they lived their own lives of humble repentance before God, they generally seemed to be at peace with God and men. Why, then, is Charles Darwin the patron saint of the modern men and women of our day? I merely inquire into the nature of human psychology at this point. Why did the masses run after men like Charles Darwin with such ardent affection and dedication over the last century? Evidently, the emotional bias towards apostasy pulls strongly on the Western psyche. The lives and institutions of billions of people around the world, from Japan and China to Russia, England, and America, were radically changed by Charles Darwin. This man's work has touched every person in every nation on earth through the educational, cultural, religious, and political institutions that affect their lives. Regrettably, Darwin's dreary influence still looms heavily over the whole world. His ideas have impacted the way everybody thinks. Godlessness prevails everywhere, in school classrooms, media, entertainment, and politics. Even for the average born-again Christian, God is often a distant reality. He seems so very far away. We may look at his creation, but we scarcely see his fingerprints anymore. We seldom use terminology that speak of the creation. Instead, we speak of ecology, biology, reproductive systems, and rising atmospheric pressure. Charles Darwin's naturalistic materialism has so changed the Western metaphysic that the average person hardly senses God's providential interaction with the world, let alone his existence. Goodreads.com conducted a poll amongst hundreds of thousands of readers who rated Darwin's On the Origin of Species as the most influential book in history, outranking the Bible, the Quran, and Marx's Communist Manifesto. In the worldwide war of worldviews, Darwin's naturalism and Marx's materialism are serious competitors against the theist worldviews of Islam and Christianity. Without question, humanism has given the theist religions a run for their money in the last 2 centuries. What remains to be seen is whether these relatively new humanist ideas will have the staying power of the Christian worldview. Thus far, the Christian faith has outlasted every world empire since Rome fell in the 400s. Nevertheless, it is the last century that captures our interest for the moment. Consider the following statistics contrasting the two worlds. Before Darwin, we'll call it BD, and after Darwin, AD. BD. In 1900, 0.2% of the world were atheists. In 1850, there would have been fewer. AD. In 2012, 21.3% of the world were atheists. 36% of 18 to 34-year-old Brits claim to be atheists/agnostics, and 63% of Brits claim to be, quote, not religious. BD. In 1815, 0% of the scientists of the day were self-described atheists. AD. In 2005, 52% of scientists in a survey conducted by National Opinion Research Center of Chicago, Illinois, said they had no religious affiliation. Compare this to the 14% of the general population who claim no religious affiliation. AD. In 2006, it was reported that 93% of the National Science Academy members were self-described atheists. The 2007 Pew Research study on American religious commitments showed a huge increase in the percentage of atheists by birth year. Greg Graffin from Cornell University studied the religious backgrounds of 151 of the leading evolutionary biologists in the United States. He found that 98.7% of them had rejected a theistic faith and had become, quote, functional atheists as a result of their training in evolutionary biology. The famous atheist of the 21st century, Christopher Hitchens, claimed that, quote, Darwin's doctrine of evolution has removed in every thinking mind the last vestige of orthodox Christianity, unquote. All of the above data points to a significant increase in professed atheism in our world. The prevalence of atheists is at least 100-fold higher than it was when Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. This is also confirmed in the testimonies of many contemporary atheists, where the road to atheism almost always begins in a biology class or with some form of Darwinian thinking. The theory of evolution affects a man psychologically more than logically. Though it was only a half-baked, poorly supported scientific hypothesis, it still appealed to men who were running from God. If God is unnecessary for the gradual development of complexity in certain life forms, then perhaps science could somehow eliminate the necessity of God as the source of all life forms, matter, and energy. What apostate scientists are looking for are pseudo-intellectual reasons to apostatize from the Christian faith. With the Darwinian hypothesis, they hope to find convenient justification for their apostasy. If man could separate God from his reality and origins, he would have no trouble separating him from his ethics, which is the real issue. If he could separate God from ethics, he wouldn't have to worry about bothersome issues like guilt, God's judgment, God's law, or even God's redemption plan in Jesus Christ. Instead, he could be a law to himself, free to determine his own ethics and his own future in a world without God. A few theistic evolutionists have argued that God, by his sovereign providence, directs a macroevolutionary process to bring about the world as we see it today. However, it is impossible to reconcile this position with the passages like Exodus 20, verse 11, without equivocating on the Hebrew word for day. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and hallowed it. Unquote. Exodus 20, verse 11. There are plenty of halfway houses on the path to apostasy, and there are many who do not understand the deep devotion and the incorrigible commitments of the apostates. The Bible-believing Christian cannot reconcile a slow evolutionary process with these words without equivocating on the word yom. Does God wish for men to work for 6 indeterminate periods of time and rest for a 7th? Obviously, the commandment speaks of 24-hour periods. This is the plain meaning of the text. Any other interpretation requires exegetical gymnastics that would compromise the hermeneutical method for the rest of divine scripture. If we haven't learned this lesson after 200 years of scientific criticism and religious apostasy, we will, no doubt, play a part in it. The young earth view of the creation bears strong roots in 2,000 years of Christian orthodoxy. We are told that the only exception to this is found in Augustine of Hippo. But this seminal Christian thinker would not agree. Speaking of the Greek pagans, he wrote, quote, They are deceived, too, by those highly mendacious documents which profess to give the history of man as many thousands of years, though reckoning by the sacred writing, we find that not 6,000 years have yet passed." Unquote. The testimony to a young earth is universal among the Church Fathers, including important figures as Barnabas, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Theophilus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and Hippolytus. We stand in good company. Without question, Darwinism was apostasy from the historical Christian faith. Charles Darwin also had a profound effect upon John Dewey, the man who mainstreamed godless humanism and pragmatism in Western education at the turn of the 20th century. We will explore this connection more when we cover the contributions of John Dewey. The well-known scientist Ernst Mayr summarizes the remarkable influence of Darwin in a well-publicized article written in 2000. Quote, "A 21st century person looks at the world quite differently than a citizen of the Victorian era did. This shift had multiple sources, particularly the incredible advances in technology. But what is not at all appreciated is the great extent to which this shift in thinking indeed resulted from Darwin's ideas. Remember that in 1850, virtually all leading scientists and philosophers were Christian men. The world they inhabited had been created by God, and as the natural theologians claimed, he had instituted wise laws that brought about the perfect adaptation of all organisms to one another and to their environment. The basic principles proposed by Darwin would stand in total conflict with these prevailing ideas. Eliminating God from science made room for strictly scientific explanations of all natural phenomena. It gave rise to positivism. It produced a powerful intellectual and spiritual revolution, the effects of which have lasted to this day." Unquote. This is a clear testimony concerning the sea change in worldviews in the Western world. If the conflict between the humanist scientific apostasy and the epistemological authority of Scripture is important to the future of the faith, then Christians should be concerned with recent losses. At the present, it appears that these losses are accelerating in every country of Protestant or Roman Catholic heritage. Of the 110 Christian universities in America, where the faith is still strongest, only about half teach creationism and oppose evolutionary Darwinism. Taking into account all public and private university instruction in this country, a mere 1% maintain a God-centered epistemology and metaphysic in the matter of origins. The Darwinian theories dominate at least 99% of higher education instruction in America, and it is safe to say that that number is closer to 99.99% in Europe. In the war of the worldviews, this appears to be a complete rout. Of the thousands of museums and science centers in America, there are fewer than 5 which maintain a young Earth, creationist perspective. Darwin's materialism has made progress since the Scopes trial of 1925. At this stage, his influence maintains almost complete sway over the scientific and educational institutions in the Western world. If not for the missionary movement that is hard at work spreading Christian gospel to every land, the kingdom of Christ would have languished. By sheer numerical quantity, the last 100 years have produced the most extensive apostasy from the Christian faith in the history of Christianity. This apostasy has been largely confined to Europe, America, Australia, and Canada. However, it is only a temporary setback. The 2,000-year expansion of the Christian faith advances by ebb and flow as the waves of Christian influence hit the shores of continents around the globe. As a result, we have seen Christianity grow significantly in Asia and Africa over the last century. 200 years ago, about 95% of Christianity was confined to Europe and America. Today, professing Christians in the West comprise about 15% of the total number of Christians in the world, and these continents represent about 16% of the world population. But the sum total impact that Charles Darwin had on the lives of hundreds of millions of Christian families is incalculable. This man was a key leader in the apostasy. It is an undeniable fact that the Christian faith was far stronger 150 years ago in England and America. Well into the 19th century, most Americans considered themselves Christians of varying levels of orthodoxy. Now their 21st century grandchildren have turned into self-professed pagans, atheists, homosexuals, witches, and agnostic scientists. The sheer numbers that will be in hell because of Charles Darwin's commitment to, quote, murder God is impossible to fathom, dreadful to contemplate. From reading the plethora of biographic materials available on Charles Darwin, it is clear that this man picked a fight with the God of the Bible, and he lost. Why boastest thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? The goodness of God endureth continually. The tongue deviseth mischiefs, like a sharp razor working deceitfully. Thou lovest evil more than good, and lying rather than to speak righteousness. Selah. Thou lovest all devouring words, thou deceitful tongue. God shall likewise destroy thee forever. He shall take thee away, and pluck thee out of thy dwelling place, and root thee out of the land of the living. Selah. The righteous also shall see and fear, and shall laugh at him. Lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusteth in the abundance of his riches, and strengthened himself in his wickedness. But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. I will praise thee forever, because thou hast done it. And I will wait on thy name, for it is good before thy saints. Psalm 52.
This has been a production of the Generations Media Network. For more information, go to generations.org/media.
Thanks for listening to Passing on the Faith. If you're looking for resources to disciple your kids and build a Christ-centered home, we'd love to help. Generations offers books, curriculum, devotionals, and tools designed to help you pass on the faith to the next generation. And just for our listeners, you can get 15% off your next order. Just use the code PASSING at checkout. That's PASSING for 15% off at generations.org. Thanks for supporting the mission of family discipleship.